Hey y'all, welcome back to the channel. We've got a fun one today because if there is anything people love, it is the big things that make other things go boom. Man, this video, this is gonna be a long one. My throat's gonna be so sore that I'm not gonna finish that sentence. Anywho, much like the frigate video, which needs to be updated, I will be discussing pre-war capital ships, move into wartime capital ships, and then finish with the post-war era. However, due to the nature of the UNSC and its tendency to mothball ships and then take them out of the ditch to use again because they can't build ships fast enough, I will be covering ships that were refitted twice. Also, the definition of a capital ship in Halo is weird. So, honestly, this is more a video detailing the most powerful of the UNSC's warships, more so than anything. That said, the system that shall not be named out of fear of offending it is an unforgiving chaos god who knows less mercy than a hospitalier when tasked with keeping a heretical prisoner alive. It's just not gonna happen. You can help me gain favor with it by liking and subscribing. Also, dropping a comment down below really helps. You know, engagement, it just really helps me out. Patreon, Discord, Instagram, and Twitter are a thing too if you ever want to chat with me, so yeah. Hi, this is this is post-production until I hear this video is easily the biggest one I have ever done, both in size and scope of editing, so please, it is not financially or physically or mentally healthy of me to sink this much into a video. So, if you wouldn't mind considering Patreon, I would greatly appreciate it. I'm tired. To start us off, we have an interesting ship. By today's standards, it is hopelessly old, small, and not much of anything. It is nothing more than a simple light destroyer from a now irrelevant era. But when it was first introduced to the human sphere, it was classified as a cruiser. First entering service in 2433, the Diligence class cruiser was used by the Colonial Military Authority for roughly a full century. Manufactured by Synovia Heavy Machinery, this line of ships was known for its unquestionable lethality. In 2496, it was refitted to host outrigger magnetic accelerator cannon platforms, though by that point the Diligence had been recategorized as a light destroyer. It boasts 1 Mark 33 Spitfire naval autocannon, 6 M60 Century naval autocannon turrets, 40 M35 Ares missile launchers, and 10 M710 Bulwark point defense guns. It is 550 meters long, 1,804 feet for my American audience. God, why can't we use the fucking metric system? With a mass of 2.2 million tons. As with modern UNSC doctrine, acting as a destroyer, the Diligence would presumably make use of wolfpack tactics to engage and bring down larger vessels via coordinated attacks. Whether or not this old but reliable line of ships carries on to this day is unknown. Next up, built by Reyes McLee's shipyards, we have the Halcyon class light cruiser. So this ship is in a bit of a gray area when it comes to capital ships. By the UNSC's own standards and doctrine, a cruiser is supposed to be a well-armed capital ship that engages and destroys enemy warships, deploys ground troops to contest planets, and simultaneously serving as command ships for battle groups and smaller task forces. This kind of makes the Halcyon a dud. In fact, it was a dud. It was such a dud that it was introduced in 2510 and was almost immediately retired after a few years. It was only taken out of retirement because the UNSC was losing more ships than they could build, so really, only reason I'm including the 2510 configuration is because, well, the UNSC says a cruiser is a capital ship and therefore we have the stupid Halcyon. Just to illustrate my point, the Halcyon, at roughly 1.2 kilometers, 3,841 feet, god damn it America, in length with a mass of 11 million tons, had 1 MAC, 6 Archer missile pods, and a number of M910 Rampart point defense guns. It could have held up to 4 Shivas, which was a ton of firepower, but that was on a really good day. Odds are it would have at most held 1, again, on a decent day. The Diligence, which was classified as a light destroyer by the time the Halcyon came into service, was more heavily armed. That's not to say the Halcyon had no good qualities. In fact, its superstructure and hull was so well constructed that the ship would be able to take a serious beating and remain able to fight. In fact, even if every compartment was breached and 90% of its armor had been compromised, the ship could remain operational. That is impressive, but there was a problem. This superstructure was horrendously overbuilt and expensive to such a degree that only 10 of the 50 other Halcyons actually had this superstructure. This basically rendered the only redeeming quality of the Halcyon to be defunct. I know I'm probably gonna have some Halcyon simping like, the Pillar of Autumn! Don't worry, we'll get to her eventually. Next up, we have the Valiant class super heavy cruiser, made by Synovia Heavy Machinery. With a length of 1.5 kilometers or 4.9 thousand feet and weighing around 17 million tons, this ship was impressive. When it was introduced in 2493, the Valiant was designed with components that were considered next generation. Specifically, it boasted impressive fusion drives and a massive command suite which would allow the crew to direct entire campaigns. Though it should be noted that the resource and manpower shortages did mean that only some of the Valiants actually had these quote-unquote next-gen aspects. Most Valiants are similar in armament, with 2 50 GE-1A magnetic accelerator cannons, 8 M66 Sentry autocannon turrets, 50 M58 Archer missile pods, 50 M910 Rampart point defense guns, and, on very good days, a number of Shiva nuclear missiles. However, command ship variants of the Valiant were better armored and replaced much of the troop and small craft complement with command staff and specialized support equipment. This included slipspace probes and umbilicals for quick loading and the offloading of officers. The Valiant would serve for the entirety of the insurrection and has been seen as late as the fall of Reach in 2552. The most famous Valiant, the Everest, was the personal flagship of Vice Admiral Preston Cole, who was arguably the most important individual in the Human Covenant War. More so than the Spartans in some regards. Whether or not the Valiant carries on to this day is unknown. Personally, I like to believe there are a few still out there. The Marathon class heavy cruiser, also made by Synovia Heavy Machinery, was introduced in 2520, 5 years before the Covenant War. With a mass of 12 million tons and a length of roughly 1.2 kilometers, this was not a ship you wanted to mess with. Originally, the Marathon was designed and fitted to be a simple ship of the line, a capital ship that was not necessarily serving as a true capital ship. However, as time went on, this line of ships would serve in a command role, especially during the darkest hours of the Human Covenant War. While it was outclassed by its Covenant counterparts, the Marathon was more than capable of holding its own in a fight. It was deemed to pose a serious threat to opposing ships, and while most have been retired in the post-war era, some remain in service to this day. It has, for an armament, 2 49 F9A1 magnetic accelerator cannons, 6 M66 Sentry autocannon turrets, 70 M58 Archer missile pods, 26 M40 longbow missile pods, 12 Helix point defense guns, and it also has a complement of 1,000 personnel, which included UNSC Marines and orbital drop shock troopers. Next up, we have an interesting classification of ships. Prowlers are a class of ships that deserve their own video, but they have a ship that can arguably count as a capital ship. The Point Blank class Prowler entered service in 2510. They serve as motherships for the long-range, long-term strategic reconnaissance operations of the Office of Naval Intelligence. They could play the role of a command ship in which UNSC staff will plan out operations based on the intel gathered. One notable ship was the Vanishing Point, which led Task Force Yama during the earliest phases of the war. At a length of 485 meters, 1,591 feet, with a mass of 1.1 million tons, she is sometimes known as a stealth cruiser, which means that for simplicity's sake, I'm keeping the Point Blank in the cruiser category. She has 1 20 F9B9 magnetic accelerator cannon, 4 M66 Sentry autocannon turrets, 80 M42 Archer missile pods, 20 M910 Rampart point defense guns, and 5 Shivas on a very good day. Moving on to the center of all major fleets, we have the carriers. The UNSC has two different types of carriers, supercarriers and tactical carriers. The class of supercarrier was a classification only reserved for the largest of the UNSC's warships, while tactical carriers were more broad in scope. The Orion class assault carrier, made by Synoviet Heavy Machinery, first entered service in 2473. With a mass of 40 million tons and a length of 2.2 kilometers, or 7.2 k feet, this ship has quite the story to tell. During the insurrection, the Orion was a symbol of the UNSC's might. An appearance of one over an outer colony would set fear and intimidation in the hearts of rebels and dissidents everywhere. They would carry a force of Marines, Scorpion tanks, and other things to an active war zone. The Orion would serve in the role of a flagship in the early days of the Covenant War. It had an impressive armament: 2 90C1E1 magnetic accelerator cannons, 70 M58 Archer missile pods, and 12 Rampart point defense guns. Ironically, the crews of Orions would go from subjecting rebellious worlds to heroically taking on entire Covenant fleets in a desperate bid to buy times for civilians and soldiers alike to escape. Most of these capital ships would be lost with all hands. Those that survived continued to carry out strikes on Covenant supply lines. The Epoch class heavy carrier is arguably one of the most famous UNSC carriers out there, coming in at a mass of 35 million tons and a length of about 2.6 kilometers. It was historic. It was the core of a great many fleets and battle groups during the insurrection and later the Covenant War. They carry aerospace units and ground troops, enabling it to project UNSC naval power by winning both the planetside and orbital wars anywhere. Alongside its crew of 1.3 thousand, it also maintained a complement of 800 Marines, 36 transports, and 24 space fighters. Its armament was something to be feared as well: 156 A2F9 MAC, 12 Sentry autocannons, 20 Bident missile pods, 12 M870 Rampart point defense guns, and 20 M810 point defense guns. In our last pre-war era ship, we have the Punic class supercarrier, also made by Synoviet Heavy Machinery. It entered service in 2490, has a length of 4 kilometers, and has a mass of 670 million tons. The UNSC Punic and its sister ships were originally meant to sustain entire CMA interdictionary campaigns. It was one of the few warships in the UNSC truly capable of taking on its Covenant counterparts. It was also the first line of ships capable of carrying frigates and destroyers in its underbelly. Its armament is arguably surpassed only by the UNSC Infinity. It has 2 CR-010 Series 6 magnetic accelerator cannons, 2 Mark 15 breakwater naval coil gun batteries, 100 M42 Archer missile pods, 20 M96 HaloLore missile pods, 80 M85 Scythe anti-aerospace turrets, and 100 M965 Fortress point defense guns. However, these ships were really costly to make and staff. The loss of one was a devastating blow which was felt throughout the entire UNSC. As more of the rare and valued Punics were lost to the Covenant, the UNSC as a whole was unable to replace them and their incredibly talented crews. The most notable loss of a Punic occurred during the fall of Reach. The UNSC Trafalgar was the flagship of the Epsilon Eridani fleet and was simultaneously seen as the pride of the Navy. When the Covenant came for the crown jewel of the UNSC, the Trafalgar would be lost with all hands. Much like the loss of the planet Reach itself, the destruction of the Trafalgar is something the UNSC really didn't recover from until well after the Covenant War. As for other Punics, it is unknown as to whether or not any actually survived the war. However, given their lack of any presence in notable UNSC fleets and battle groups post-war, well, I personally believe the Punic is now an extinct line of ships. The UNSC did not really employ the use of many new capital ships during the war, and for good reason. The massacre at the outer colonies was a devastating blow to humanity that I do not think people really grasp. By 2490, there were over 800 colonies in the human sphere. 210 of them were inner colonies. The rest were outer colonies. The inner colonies manufactured everything and ran the show, but the outer colonies provided raw material and food. All of this kept society going. In just 10 years, nearly 3/4 of all human worlds were gone. Their food and materials went with them, and the survivors poured into the inner colonies in the billions. It was a complete disaster that totally uprooted everything. The UNSC lost chunks of their fleet, they lost the ability to replace their ships properly, the government ceased to be effective, almost everything they had sent to defend the outer colonies was either melted or came back half burnt. It was bad. Really bad. Just put yourselves in the shoes of HighCom. You are already in the middle of a civil war, which you were not winning or losing per se, and then an enemy which you were completely unprepared for, one that you didn't even know existed until it was already kicking down the damn door, slaps you around, burns most of your planets, breaks your shit, kills your armies, and creates the literal worst refugee crisis in human history. You have very few agricultural centers in the inner colonies, and even worse, you have the industrial infrastructure to make stuff, but you have no materials to make the stuff. Just about all of your infrastructure capable of gathering raw material and the land you had for food is gone, burned, and occupied by the enemy. Luckily, space is huge, and you have a lot of untapped resources in the inner colonies, but it will be years before the necessary infrastructure is finished. So, out of desperation, literally any gun you can get is pulled out of storage. You're basically the fucking United Kingdom after France fell. It doesn't matter how old it is, if it can shoot, you will fucking use it. You grab the Halcyons, the Diligence, the Hillsborough, and maybe some ships left over from the 24th century. Oh, and why not shove some guns on the colony ships? That'll work. Oh, you mean we can't supply the army with the MA5 series? Just give them the MA37 and some old VKs. I'm sure it'll be fine. When I say that the UNSC lost a lot of stuff, it lost a lot of stuff. So most capital ships the UNSC made during the war were more or less just refitted old stuff, and the newer things were either made in really small quantities or showed up too late to make a damn difference. In fact, a lot of the ships that were made in the post-war era were designed and prototyped during the war, but only entered service right after it. So with that in mind, let's start off with the rust buckets. Within the first year of the war, the writing was on the wall for the UNSC. They knew it well. They figured that, right off the bat, they had to start getting old ships out of storage and modernized before it was too late. Hence, the Halcyon got a second breath of life. The 2525 Halcyon class refit was given new titanium A battle plating and new weapons, with roughly 1 Mark II 56 A2D4 light magnetic accelerator cannon, 4 Mark 33 Spitfire naval coil gun batteries, 4 M66 Sentry autocannons, 20 M58 Archer missile pods, 40 M810 Helix point defense guns, and yeah. Being present, this also had a crew of 2,200 sailors and marines. However, the Halcyon would get a third breath of life with a 2552 refit, though only the Pillar of Autumn actually got said refit. Late into the war, the UNSC was getting desperate, so it crafted a plan, Operation Red Flag. The goal of this was to make a ship that could hold its own, that would have an ace crew, an impressive complement of marines, ODSTs, vehicles, and most importantly, house the Spartan IIs. This ship, this magnificent chariot of the gods, would venture deep into Covenant-occupied territory, find the Covenant capital, capture the Covenant leadership, and force a ceasefire, ending the war on UNSC terms. This was a stupid plan, and I have a bonus video coming out a week after this one. Patrons can watch it now. But nonetheless, the Pillar of Autumn was refit to be a glorious ship. And she was glorious indeed. There is a lot to this ship, so I will start with the interior and move outwards to the exterior of the ship. Though if you do want a true, most detailed breakdown, Installation 00 has a video on it. It's great. Feel free to check it out after this one. I will have it linked below. Firstly, the Pillar of Autumn would need to be completely refit to stand a chance at accomplishing the task set out for her. As a result, just about everything inside and outside of her was overhauled. Her reactor was a good place to start. Prior to being refit, the Autumn's source of power only supplied about 10% the power of a standard 2552 UNSC-made reactor. To make up for this, the Autumn was refitted with a set of improved nuclear fusion engines. 2 smaller reactors would be placed around 1 large reactor, which would allow the Autumn to put out 300% more power for short periods of time if needed. Experimental systems were also integrated into the Autumn. Rapid cycling Mac coils and prototype capacitors allowed the ship to punch well above its weight. Its 56 A2D4 Mac actually extends for 2/3 of the length of the ship. The cruiser's dropship bays were expanded substantially, allowing for 216 SOEV drop pods to be carried. The Autumn's hangars also gave it a hefty complement. 2 D-96 Albatross cargo dropships, 12 D-77 Pelican dropships, 5 GATL-1 Longsword fighter bombers, 60 M12 Warthog ATVs, and 20 M808 Scorpion MBTs. As for the bridge, in order to hold an AI as powerful as Cortana, it was given a Tier 3 data core. To top things off, the Autumn had the famous honeycomb superstructure, making it very difficult to truly destroy or cripple. Complementing her superstructure was her armored hull. Her old plating was replaced with what was at the time the latest titanium A ablative armor plating. She also had an array of multi-purpose scanners towards the stern of the ship, and her foremast contained a number of slipspace navigation sensors with hardened BattleNet transponders. Finally, towards the bow, there are planetary survey sensors with launchers to send out probes. As for her engines, she had 2 primary Boglin Field Starfire 4 fusion rockets accompanied by auxiliary fusion rockets that were not really efficient, but they were compact, which was more than enough. Finally, her armament. Atop her Mac, the Autumn had 8 Mark 33 Spitfire naval coil gun batteries, 6 M66 Sentry autocannon turrets, 32 M58 Archer missile pods, and 18 M910 Rampart point defense guns. Oh, and she had a crew of 1,000 complemented by 800 Marines and 400 ODSTs. All in all, the Autumn was an incredible ship that would go on to inspire the Autumn class, a line of ships named after her. Next up, we have the Spirit of Fire. In actuality, she was a pre-war vessel as she received her refits during the insurrection, but she saw all of her action during and after the Covenant Wars, so I will count her as a wartime vessel. Originally, the Spirit of Fire was a colony ship, which launched on January 2nd, 2473. When the insurrection was at its height, she was transferred over to UNSC Control, where she received her refit, just in time for the Covenant War. She would see most of her action in the Harvest campaign, where she assisted Battle Group D for the duration of the campaign. She would go on to fight at Arcadia, where she kicked the Covenant off the planet, before finally making a stand at a strange Forerunner shield world. She prevented the Covenant from acquiring a fleet of Forerunner dreadnoughts, giving the UNSC a chance to fight another day. After escaping the shield world's destruction, she was without a slipspace drive and her crew went into cryo. The Spirit of Fire was declared lost with all hands back home. 28 years later, the crew of this capital ship would be reawakened to a disturbing reality. Something had brought them far outside the galaxy to Installation 00, the Lesser Ark, where she remains to this day fighting the Banished. Now let's talk about the specs of the ship itself. Manufactured by Halifax Spaceworks, Luna, the Spirit of Fire is about 2.5 kilometers in length with a mass of 44 million metric tons. She is the embodiment of a capital ship designed to facilitate ground campaigns. Firstly, she has huge hangars. Starter cargo dropships and orbital transfer vehicles are held in these 8 bays. The hangars connect to a cargo hold which stretches from one side of the ship to the other. There are also Heron cargo dropships which can be launched from the Spirit to deploy prefabricated base structures only minutes after being ordered. To top that off, the Spirit of Fire has a number of robotic factory lines, nicknamed War Factories, which allows her to produce virtually anything in the UNSC's arsenal with a few exceptions. Prior to her departure for Harvest, she was overstocked with everything she would need in preparation for a sustained siege, meaning she could replace her losses for years. This basically means that for all intents and purposes, she has a bottomless stockpile only limited by manpower and modules. She also has very comfortable livings for her crew. Because she was once a colony ship, she still contains most of the amenities she would have prior to military service. In other words, she has a farm, hobby workshops, educational terminals, and expansive medical facilities. The Spirit of Fire's armament is pretty impressive for a colonial vessel turned warship. She has 3 22 B6R3 Max, 10 11 A2R1 naval coil gun batteries, 24 M42 Archer missile pods, and 40 M800 Rampart point defense guns. As for her complement, the Spirit of Fire is in possession of 10 D-20 Heron Heavy Lift dropships, 6 D-96 Albatross cargo dropships, 56 D-82 Darter cargo dropships, 70 D-77 Pelican dropships, 178 M12 Warthog ATVs, 93 M808 Scorpion MBTs, and 600 M88 2-3 HEV drop pods. Of course, she can replace any losses she takes in this department with ease. As for her crew, she has 3,500 Navy, 1 UEG civilian, that being Professor Anders. Alongside her crew, there are 6,000 Marines, 2,000 Army, and 1,000 ODSTs. Finally, we have the post-war era vessels. As I said earlier, many of these were designed and prototyped during the war, but they entered service after it. In the case of our first line of ships, they technically already saw action during the war, but were put in their own line post-war, and that is the Autumn class. Given the Pillar of Autumn's impressive feats, a new line of cruisers was commissioned based upon the Autumn's design. The Autumn class, manufactured by Synoviet Heavy Machinery, is roughly 1.4 kilometers in length and has a mass of 10.1 million tons. This ship is meant to strike a balance between firepower, mobility, armor, ease of manufacturing, and crew requirements. The first of these ships were built on recycled Halcyon class light cruiser hulls, making use of the improvements and modifications employed by the Pillar of Autumn herself. The Autumn class is one of the first UNSC ships to make use of shielding. However, the shielding employed by this line of cruisers is different from the traditional shielding of its Covenant counterparts. The ship's electromagnetic armor incorporates a distributed array of small shield generators that are cheap and easy to make. When the titanium A hull plates are about to sustain damage, sensors within the armor trigger the closest generator. This generator effectively shields that area. Like the Pillar of Autumn, the Autumn class makes use of various survey sensors and probe launchers. However, the UNSC has mimicked the Covenant's advanced hyperscanner detectors combined with the naval BattleNet relays. The Autumn class also makes use of armor cowlings to protect its fusion engines. They are, bluntly put, the result of lessons learned the hard way during the insurrection. The Autumn class makes use of drop pod bays with accommodations for a company of orbital drop shock troopers, and it has modular hangar bays that can be swapped out depending on the mission it's going on. These bays typically carry up to a dozen D-77 or D-79 Pelican dropships. It also features the latest Mark 40 Spitfire naval coil gun batteries. In comparison to its widely used older sibling, the Mark 33, the Mark 40 has a higher muzzle velocity with improved tracking speed and far better accuracy. The gun mount itself is armored with titanium A formulation, which shaves a few tons off each turret without exposing them. Unlike the Pillar of Autumn, the Autumn class has less troops and a smaller crew, with about 800 Navy, 45 Marines, and sometimes 220 or so ODSTs. Its armament consists of 145 J3D3 MAC, 4 Mark 40 Spitfire naval coil gun batteries, 6 M66 Sentry autocannon turrets, 32 M58 Archer missile pods, and 6 M910 Rampart point defense guns. Next up, we have the Vindication class light battleship. Okay, side tangent. So, I have seen people get really needlessly angry over the whole light battleship thing, and when I say needlessly, I mean like going after the entire 343 Industries and calling everyone who writes the lore incompetent over this one tiny thing. You know who you are. So, let's talk about why it's called a light battleship. So, firstly, ship classifications. Bear in mind, I'm not an expert. I'm not qualified to talk about this at all. I'm purely speaking off of my own observations of history and my reading of actual books and papers by, actual qualified experts. People tend to not understand that war does in fact change. Don't believe what Fallout says. It's fucking lying to you. War changes every few years. We tend to get rooted and fixated on the old-fashioned way of doing things. Like, when we think of battles, we think of the kinds of things we'd see in, like, the Second World War. But we don't fight wars that way anymore. And, I don't know if you noticed, but a certain Eastern Eurasian country that I will not name for obvious reasons has not learned anything since 1945, and it is paying the price in a certain Eastern European country. So, yeah, no, we don't fight wars like it's World War II anymore. And just as an example of warfare changing really fast, Take torpedo boats. They were pretty damn scary in their day, especially in the early 20th century. They basically remade naval engagements, so as a result, catchers, in quotes, were made, and these catchers became torpedo boat destroyers. These torpedo boat destroyers became the first, destroyers. And destroyers are now still in use today, but in a fundamentally different manner. We don't use torpedo boats anymore because the torpedo boat destroyers made them obsolete. We have fast attack craft, which are similar, but they are not torpedo boats. In fact, a submarine can do what a torpedo boat does better. Or how about real-life battleships? After the Second World War, they were phased out pretty quickly in the scale of history. In fact, today, there is only one battleship active as we would know it, and it's just a nuclear-powered battlecruiser in possession of that Eastern Eurasian country that just started a war. Why is that? Well, the battleship is... okay. Well, since I'm not an expert, let's go to an actual expert. Robert Farley is a senior lecturer at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, and he is a visiting professor at the U.S. Army's War College. His work stems from maritime affairs to military doctrine and beyond. He is the author of The Battleship Book, and he basically summarized the reasoning perfectly. New technologies meant that war was changing and things could do the job of a battleship better. I'll just read a small piece of Farley's statements on the matter. The battleship era ended not because the ships lacked utility, but rather because they could no longer fulfill their roles in a cost-effective manner. Battleships, in the end, are simply a delivery system for ordnance. When other platforms became capable of delivering ordnance more efficiently, the battleship began to disappear." End quote. So yeah, war changes. How we use platforms can change. How effective a platform can be is determined by how it is used, and how we classify that platform is also subject to change. So, coming back to the Vindication class light battleship, it actually makes a lot of sense. The Vindication has one purpose: to be a ship killer that destroys or cripples enemy carriers, and supporting vessels in a deadly opening volley. If a battleship is simply meant to act as a giant moving delivery system for ordnance, then that is precisely what the Vindication is. It makes use of two experimental Mark X magnetic accelerator cannons to hit its target. The Macs do take a while to recharge, so it has to have escorting vessels to protect it. It may be called a light battleship because there are heavier types of battleships out there, kind of like how the Halcyon is a light cruiser, or the way the UNSC employs battleships has changed. Notably, in the encyclopedia, the Vindication is classified with the destroyers, and not in its own category, so perhaps battleships are not actually meant to serve as capital ships or command ships. Maybe it is just called a light battleship because the UNSC's carriers are armed just as well or better than it, and those carriers also carry a hefty complement. If that were the case, then the Vindication may just simply be a hybrid between a capital ship and a regular old destroyer. The point is, warfare in Halo has changed a lot. I'm not an expert, but to me, the Vindication being called a light battleship is not as outrageous as I've heard a few snowflakes make it out to be. The Vindication is about 1.6 kilometers in length, with a mass of 12 million tons. It entered service in 2554 and was manufactured by Martian metal shipyards. Atop its Mac batteries, it has 50 M58 Archer missile pods, 4 M60 Sentry naval autocannons, and 12 M910 Rampart Point defense guns. Next up, we have the Poseidon class light carrier. This ship entered service only months after the Covenant War ended. Made by Martian metal shipyards, the Poseidon has a mass of 2.8 million tons and is 719 meters in length. These ships are actually pretty cheap and easy to make. I wouldn't even call it a capital ship were it not for the fact that it is a tactical carrier which is supposed to remain at the center of battle groups as a command ship. They only require a small crew and don't have much in the way of an armament. In fact, corvettes are better armed. It has 2 M42 Archer missile pods, 2 2551 Onager mech turrets, and 20 M870 Rampart Point defense guns. Other than that, we don't know much about these ships. I do have some theories, though. So, simply put, the UNSC had very few naval assets by the end of the war. Also, what it had left were mainly frigates and destroyers, with a large number of its heavy-hitting ships being destroyed, crippled, or under repairs. Given the terrible state of the UNSC Navy, they would need something to organize small battle groups and fleets. So the Poseidon was the solution, perhaps, at least in theory. Cheap and easy to make, small crew to account for a manpower shortage, and could probably carry a small complement of broadswords or longswords. And most importantly, it has the capability to fill the role of a command ship. And now, finally, you have all been waiting for it. The UNSC Infinity! Well, the Infinity class supercarrier, but really just the Infinity herself. The Infinity entered service in 2553. But it was actually commissioned in 2557 in an official capacity. Made by Special Assembly Plant Concord, this supercarrier has a mass of 907 million tons and is roughly 5.7 kilometers in length. The Infinity class incorporates the most advanced UNSC, Covenant, and Forerunner components available. The amount of manpower and material dedicated to this line of ships is insane. Currently, the only ship in service is, or should I say was, the Infinity. Rest in peace, you beautiful bastard of a ship. You deserved better. For those of you new to Halo, the Infinity herself is such a major part of modern-day Halo that she warrants her own video. But more or less, here is a summary. At the height of the Covenant War, there was an incredibly important project. Project Ouroboros, which is the unified Earth government's continuously evolving plan to preserve human civilization in the event of a catastrophic collapse of society, be it the Covenant or Insurrection's fault. One of the major elements of this was the Infinity. She was envisioned as a massive colony ship meant to carry the last bastions of humanity to the farthest regions of the galaxy. However, she would be repurposed for a military role mid-construction. While the Infinity's construction began in 2544, she would not be ready for combat for 9 years. She wouldn't be commissioned in any official capacity for an additional 4, and some of her most vital components were worked on prior to the ship's construction, meaning that the Infinity's overall time to be constructed, put into service, and then commissioned was a minimum of 20 years. However, when she was finished, she became the flagship of the fleet, literally being described as, well, being in a class of her own until her sister ship, the Eternity, is finished. The Infinity was very important in the post-war era until it was destroyed over Zeta Halo. One thing to note about the Infinity before we go over its specs. In 2558, it had a retrofit in which damaged, worn, or older components or systems were swapped out. They were replaced by things meant for the Eternity, so when I discuss the specs for the supercarrier, I'm referring to the 2558 retrofit. Firstly, what is easily the most prominent component of the UNSC Infinity is its Forerunner systems. The Infinity had a massive sublight engine module linked with a translight engine, which itself is built around a powerful Forerunner slipspace drive. This made the UNSC Infinity the most advanced ship in the fleet by default, and that does not even include the various other technological elements which were both Forerunner and Covenant in nature. Engine module interlinks based on Covenant control restrictors allowed the crew of the Infinity to connect the Forerunner module to UNSC standard and power and data feeds. The next prominent feature of the Infinity happens to be her sub-vessel bays. Her 10 internal hangars allowed her to carry and support its own fleet of Strident, Anlace, and Mulsanne-class frigates. Notably, in the book Shadows of Reach, the Infinity was able to wage a protracted but admittedly limited engagement with the Banished with just herself and her frigates. Her next very impressive feature happens to be her 4 Series 8 magnetic accelerator cannons, which are literally able to fire rounds that travel at 25% the speed of light. Oh my god. I know that seems like just a number, but that's basically just the ship going, screw physics, all my homies hate physics. At presumably lower power settings, these max can... Excuse me, sorry. Just such a ludicrous number. Okay. Okay. At presumably lower power settings, these mechs can deliver cargo pods and even launch extremely small spacecraft. The Infinity also has a number of wavecom data links for superluminal communications. It also has an aft sensor array which has a long-range hyperscanner and a luminary for locating Forerunner artifacts. Its armament is, well, it's hefty. 4 Series 8 magnetic accelerator cannons, 350 M42 Archer missile pods, 250 M75 Rapier missile pods, 190 M97 Lance missile pods, 500 M96 Howler missile pods, 85 M85 Scythe anti-aerospace turrets, 10 2551 Onager Mac turrets, and 830 M965 Fortress Point defense guns. The Infinity also came with complete shielding, the Misria Armory MG44 and heavy dispersal field generators. They're some pretty tough lads. Don't mess with them. Her interior complement is just as impressive as her exterior armament. She maintains a complement of 10 docked Anlace or Strident class frigates, 8 D-96 Albatross cargo dropships, 150 D-79 HTC Pelican dropships, and 4 F-41E broadsword fighters, 10 Mammoth mobile bases, 560 M12 Warthog ATVs, 80 M850 Scorpion tanks, 329 M9407 Soviet drop pods, and 124 M9923 HAV drop pods. The Infinity class is also pretty much self-sufficient. She even boasts a variety of luxurious facilities only afforded to colony ships, meaning if you were to serve on one, it basically becomes a second home in every sense of the word. There were literally bars and restaurants on the Infinity, such as the Full Moon. It was a mobile city. It also had an atrium called Memorial Park. It contained gardens and activity centers under a massive artificial sky dome. Of course, the Infinity also had its own abilities to perform R&D when exploring, and it could produce its own components. This is thanks to the Science Deck, which is a huge underbelly dome of research facilities dedicated to pretty much everything. And because the Infinity would sometimes be traveling for weeks or months at a time, there are several training areas which include the second largest military simulation and test environments in the human sphere. Here is where the infamous war games were run, where Spartans and Marines would train for every possible scenario and operation. Because the Infinity was such a massive ship, she needed a massive crew. This included 8,900 Navy, 1,700 Naval Intelligence personnel, 480 UEG civilians such as diplomats, contractors, and of course researchers, 24 representatives from the Swords of St. Helios, and 8 unknown special assets. Personally, I like to believe that they are Huragok, also known as engineers. You may know them as the Floaty Boys from Halo 3 ODST. There is also a number of permanently stationed Marine and ODST expeditionary units to the Infinity. They are organized into 5 separate task forces which can operate independently of each other if needed. In total, the Infinity had 5,400 Marines, a redacted number of Spartans, 800 Army, 750 ODSTs, and 200 Air Force. To say the least, the Infinity class is impressive, and the loss of the UNSC Infinity is a devastating blow for so many reasons. Firstly, the Infinity was effectively the mobile capital ship of the exiled UNSC after Halo 5. She was literally considered the last hope of humanity. In other words, if she was gone, it was genuinely believed at the time that the UNSC would lose its ability to keep fighting, and to an extent, that is exactly what happened. The UNSC is now scattered in isolated pockets with limited communications with each other that are unable to do very much for the moment. Most of the Spartans are gone, flat out dead. The loss of a few teams of Spartans is something that at times can be felt across the UNSC. Now imagine losing hundreds of Spartans all at once. And that's not accounting for the incredible talent of the Infinity's crew, its forces, and the experience lost with those who died. Even before losing just about everything, the UNSC struggled to replace major capital ships. The Infinity took over a decade to complete and staff. I would argue that the loss of the Infinity alone is equal to that of the UNSC Trafalgar Overreach, actually even more so than that. And that's not even accounting for the treasure trove of unique technologies that will not be replaced. That Forerunner tech is gone, the biggest one of those being the slipspace drive core, which the UNSC is never going to be able to come close to replicating. Even if the Eternity finishes, she will be impressive, very impressive, but she will not be the Infinity. In fact, she would be a step back from the Infinity, though frankly, the Eternity is something the UNSC really needs, and I hope to see her soon. Okay, wow. That was a lot. How long have I been recording? Oh, okay, well, just about an hour now. Notwithstanding editing, I think this might be my longest video ever. It definitely took more time to record than How a Galaxy Fell. Wow. My throat is killing me. Just a reminder, like, subscribe, Patreon's a thing, talk to me on Discord, Twitter, Instagram, and, I will see you in the cosmos, friends.